The 17th of January 1945. Somewhere west of the Rhine, in a village whose church had lost its roof and whose windows breathed frost into the dark. The snow along the road was no longer white. It had been ground into gray powder by boots, wagon wheels, and the retreating iron of war. A German infantryman, his greatcoat stiff with damp and smoke, stood in the lee of a shattered wall and watched something small pass from one hand to another. Not bread, not ammunition, not money. A cigarette. Thin, white, machine, perfect, American. It moved across that frozen ruin with more authority than a banknote, more certainty than a speech, more quiet power than a medal on a field marshal's chest. For a moment, in the bitter air, its ember glowed like a tiny furnace from another world. And in that ember, a truth flickered that many German soldiers had spent years refusing to see. The war on the Western Front was often remembered in the language of thunder: bombers over rail yards, tank engines in the Ardennes, artillery across the Ruhr plain. But wars are also decided by smaller sounds. The creak of trucks at night, the crackle of waxed ration cartons, the tear of foil paper around tobacco, the match struck in a cupped hand. Men at the front understood this better than politicians. A grand strategy announced itself in maps and arrows, but its real shape could be seen in the ordinary objects that reached a freezing foxhole on time. In the winter of 1944 and 1945, many German soldiers began to understand American power, not only by the Sherman tank or the P-47 overhead, but by the improbable fact that the enemy seemed able to send cigarettes everywhere into rations, into aid parcels, into liberated towns, into the pockets of drivers, medics, tankers, and military police, until tobacco itself became a visible sign of a logistical civilization that still had breath to spare. That mattered because the war they had been taught to imagine was very different. Nazi propaganda had spent years portraying the United States as rich but hollow, technically impressive but spiritually weak, a country of comfort, noise, and money without discipline. In August 1942, Joseph Goebbels sneered that America's greatest technical accomplishments are refrigerators and radios, and mocked the nation as one that lacked culture while being intoxicated by numbers and wealth. In the same essay, he wrote with contempt, "If the Americans lacked money, they would probably be the most despised people in the world." The line was meant as ridicule. It implied that American abundance concealed inner softness, and that wealth would rot morale rather than sustain it. Many Germans absorbed that lesson deeply. They expected an enemy who would look impressive from a distance and then collapse under hardship. The illusion had roots older than the war itself. In the authoritarian imagination, material plenty often appears decadent. Too many goods suggest weak nerves. Too much comfort suggests an inability to suffer. To men raised on the cult of hardness, the mechanized generosity of a democracy could look like moral slackness. Germany's propaganda machine fed that belief with relish. America was described as mongrel, commercial, overfed, unheroic, a nation of consumers rather than fighters. The Reich celebrated deprivation as proof of seriousness. Hunger became virtue. Scarcity became discipline. Endurance became an ideology. In that world, the man who marched without complaint through mud and cold was spiritually superior to the man who received soap, coffee, chocolate, dry socks, medicine, spare fuel, and cigarettes. The first looked hard. The second looked spoiled. The first fit the myth. The second, in time, would win the war. That contradiction began to reveal itself long before Germany collapsed. By 1944, the Americans who landed in France did not arrive as an improvised expedition, barely hanging on. They came ashore as the armed extension of an economy vast enough to convert industrial scale into routine. Their strength was not only in factories at home, it was in systems, packaging, standardization, transport, and repetition. It was in the ability to move not just tanks and fuel, but the 1,000 lesser things that keep a soldier functioning as a human being. U.S. Army field rations in the Second World War routinely included cigarettes. The Army Historical Foundation notes that during World War II, mini packs of 3 or 4 cigarettes with waterproof matches were included in rations for fighting troops. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Museum records that K-ration breakfast packets contained 4 cigarettes, that later K-ration accessory items included cigarettes and matches, and that the 1,944 accessory packet for C rations included 9 good commercial quality cigarettes. Stanford's Tobacco Archive summarizes the practical result bluntly. K-rations provided a 4-pack per meal, meaning 12 cigarettes per day, and soldiers could still buy discounted 20 packs at post exchanges. That does not mean every American soldier was content, well-fed, dry, and cheerful every day. Frontline war is too dirty and erratic for that. Men still froze, cursed, bled, and went hungry between deliveries. But the scale of provision mattered. A German soldier picking through a captured American ration was not merely finding tobacco. He was finding surplus built into a fighting system. Someone, somewhere, had judged that a combat soldier should receive not only calories and ammunition, but a stimulant, a comfort, a ritual, a small slice of home. That judgment was expensive. It required ships, trains, depots, warehouses, quartermasters, convoy routes, accountants, planners, manufacturers, printers, packers, and drivers. It required an industrial society confident enough to spend resources on morale because it could afford to. The cigarette in the ration was not trivial. It was a white, paper-wrapped expression of national capacity. If the Americans could indulge such details, the Germans could not. By late war, too many Wehrmacht units lived in a narrowing world. Boots wore out faster than they were replaced. Fuel shortages shrank mobility. Transport depended heavily on horses, even as the enemy multiplied trucks. Rail lines were cratered, bridges cut, depots bombed, and schedules dissolved into guesswork. A unit might still retain courage, discipline, and tactical skill, yet feel itself being slowly compressed by want. Scarcity entered not just the stomach, but the imagination. Men learned to save everything: candle stubs, bits of wire, empty tins, dry paper, a crust of bread. Under those conditions, the American cigarette seemed almost insulting. Not because it was luxurious, but because it suggested a world in which even luxuries could be systematized. The difference became undeniable after Normandy. By mid-July 1944, more than 1 million Allied soldiers were ashore in France, yet the breakout from the beachhead created a crisis of distance. The armies advanced faster than ports and railways could support them. So, the Americans answered with motion. The Red Ball Express began in August 1944, with more than 6,000 trucks, operated around the clock, and over 82 days delivered roughly 412,000 tons of fuel, food, ammunition, and equipment to 28 divisions. The National World War II Museum describes it as part of the miracle of supply, and quotes Time magazine, calling it a tradition the Germans have never really understood. Born from a people accustomed to great spaces, nationwide trucking, endless roads, and millions of automobiles. The official Army transportation history adds another stark figure. More than 800,000 200-ton trucks were manufactured in the United States during the war, an amount no other army in the conflict could match. To a German soldier on the receiving end, this miracle of supply was first encountered not in staff reports but in annoying persistence. American artillery that did not seem to run dry. American armored columns that reappeared after losses. Bridges repaired. Dumps refilled. Medical units stocked. Convoys replacing what had been burned yesterday. And amid the martial essentials, there was the strange presence of abundance in miniature. Chocolate bars, chewing gum, canned fruit, coffee, and cigarettes. The cigarette mattered especially because it could be used, traded, shared, hoarded, or simply displayed. It had portability. It crossed social boundaries. It left the private pocket and entered public space. A shell was fired once and vanished. A cigarette moved from soldier to civilian, from victor to prisoner, from ration carton to black market stall. It became visible history. German high command, despite its pride, knew what this meant. Post-war interrogation records preserve the brutal clarity of defeat stripped of mythology. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt said flatly that if German air forces had been at parity before D-Day, the invasion would have never succeeded. He also described the real wound inflicted by Allied control of the air. These attacks were painful for moving our troops, our supplies, and our gas. Railroad attacks were devastating, he said, and on roads, our convoys, or a single MT, could not move during the day. That sentence reveals a truth larger than air power alone. A modern army dies not only when its men lose heart, but when movement itself is broken, when supply becomes daylight prey. The American cigarette reached the front because American movement survived. The German army increasingly fought in a world where movement had to hide. Imagine, then, the emotional contrast in the field. A German soldier might once have expected Americans to fight comfortably and quit early, to cling to convenience, to lose resolve when exposed to cold and blood. Instead, he found an enemy that could endure combat while remaining attached to comfort, and this was the unnerving part. American softness did not exist in the expected way. The men cursed in foxholes, buried their dead, panicked under artillery, and kept going. They drank bad coffee, slept in mud, and still lit cigarettes from ration sleeves that seemed to multiply like ammunition. The old authoritarian assumption had been wrong. Comfort had not destroyed will. Comfort, when industrially sustained, had strengthened it. A man who could count on some familiar ritual in the middle of chaos was not necessarily weaker. He might be steadier. This steadiness was built into American war culture long before 1944. The Army Historical Foundation repeats an old saying attributed to Pershing from the First World War that cigarettes were more important to soldiers than bullets. Whether exaggerated or not, the spirit of the remark survived into the next war. Tobacco companies sent cigarettes by millions to GIs overseas, as wartime promotion boasted, and the military accepted tobacco as a practical necessity for morale. It is easy now to read this only as a story about smoking. In wartime, it was also a story about psychological maintenance. The American system accepted that men under extreme strain required rituals of self-regulation, however unhealthy. A cigarette after shellfire, on sentry duty, or in the pause before dawn became a way to mark time, calm hands, and reclaim a sliver of autonomy. When German soldiers encountered American tobacco in the field, they were also encountering a bureaucratized compassion toward the ordinary soldier's nerves. That compassion was imperfect and uneven, like the democracy that produced it. One of the most striking facts about the Red Ball Express is that roughly 3/4 of its drivers were African-American servicemen. Many were very young. Some had not been trained as truck drivers before being pressed into the role. They kept the arteries open for armies that were fighting in the name of freedom abroad, while segregation remained real at home. This contradiction should not be hidden, because it sharpens the meaning of American abundance rather than diminishing it. The cigarettes that reached white riflemen, black drivers, medics, tank crews, and military police traveled through a democracy whose promises were incomplete but active contested, expanding, and still materially generative. The Reich had promised unity and hierarchy. America delivered disorder, inequality, argument, and an astonishing quantity of fuel, food, tires, parts, and tobacco. History would decide which system could better survive its own contradictions. For German soldiers, the revelation often came as humiliation wrapped in paper. On the battlefield, one can hate enemy fire. It is harder to hate enemy normalcy. A truckload of shells is terrifying, but understandable. A man under bombardment who still has dry matches and a fresh pack of cigarettes seems to belong to a reality too large to be interrupted by one destroyed road or one failed attack. The cigarette's insult lay in its casualness. It implied reserves. It implied redundancy. It implied that the machine behind the man was not straining at its limits, but operating with room to spare. In a war of attrition, that is a devastating sight. There were moments when this truth passed from suspicion into certainty. A German unit overran an American position and found ration wrappers, empty tins, and cigarette stubs everywhere. Another saw liberated civilians already bartering for American tobacco within hours of the front passing. Others encountered American prisoners, dead men, or supply dumps, and noticed the sheer standardization of the thing: labels, brands, cartons, matchbooks, neat accessories, and packets. The object repeated itself. That repetition mattered. 1 cigarette could be luck, 10 could be habit. 10,000 meant a system. The German soldier, staring at that repetition, was not really studying tobacco. He was studying the enemy's ability to transform private industry, military planning, shipping, and local exchange into one seamless current. By the winter battles in the Ardennes and along the German frontier, this current had acquired an almost mythic quality. American units were battered, surprised, and sometimes badly mauled, yet they continued to receive reinforcements, fuel, food, and all the trivia of everyday war. The Germans, in contrast, increasingly attacked with borrowed time. Their offensives often depended on seizure, capture American fuel, capture American trucks, capture American stores. Even when boldness remained, it was a boldness inside a shrinking house. And there is a psychological difference between an army advancing on what it makes and an army advancing on what it hopes to take. The first radiates confidence. The second radiates appetite. When a German soldier saw American cigarettes being traded in ruined villages, he confronted a simple but merciless fact. The enemy had so much supply that even leftovers were entering local economies before the shooting had fully stopped. The post-war collapse of Germany would make this visible to everyone. In occupied Berlin and across defeated Germany, the Reichsmark became nearly worthless, and cigarettes emerged as makeshift currency. The National Archives records that American soldiers could buy 10 packs of cigarettes for 50 cents at the PX and sell them on the black market for $100. An intelligence report cited by the archive said a carton of American cigarettes could fetch $200 from Soviet soldiers in Berlin. The National Army Museum likewise notes that, in occupied Germany, goods like cigarettes and coffee served as makeshift currency, and that packets of cigarettes bought cheaply by Allied servicemen could be sold for enormous profit in Reichsmarks on the black market. By then, the cigarette had become what it had always hinted at being: not merely a consumable, but a unit of trust in a shattered economy. But German soldiers had seen the omen earlier, before the formal surrender, before the black market stalls and occupation lines. They had seen it in Belgium, in France, on the western approaches to the Reich, in barns used as aid stations, and crossroads where refugees clustered in silence. A cigarette was traded for bread. A few cigarettes for eggs. A carton for labor, information, or a bottle. The paper money of the collapsing order remained official. The tobacco of the advancing order became real. This is how ideologies die in practice. not only when their flags fall, but when their money ceases to command instinctive belief, and another object, small, foreign, absurdly ordinary, begins to do the work more effectively. That foreign object carried another meaning too. The American cigarette was standardized, branded, and mass-produced, yet it also moved through free choice. One could smoke it, save it, give it, sell it, or refuse it. It was industrial, but it entered the world of personal decision. In miniature, it embodied a paradox at the heart of the United States during the war: centralized mobilization, serving a decentralized society. Factories, military depots, quartermaster systems, and convoy routes produced the thing. But once it reached the pocket, it belonged to the individual soldier. The Reich could demand sacrifice with absolute rhetoric, but its shrinking material world left less room for personal agency. America, by contrast, could sustain discipline while still allowing private latitude in the handling of everyday goods. A cigarette, after a firefight, was never democracy in pure form. Yet to men raised under a system that increasingly rationed life down to obedience and need, it could look remarkably close. There was cruelty in this, of course, not the cruelty of the cigarette itself, but of comparison. Many German soldiers had gone to war convinced that moral hardness would triumph over material plenty. They found instead that plenty had its own morale. An army that could feed its men, treat its wounded, replace its trucks, bomb its enemies, print its labels, distribute its matches, and still include cigarettes in an accessory packet was not spoiled. It was coherent. It possessed what ideologues often underestimate: depth. The depth of warehouses, of petroleum, of roads, of spare parts, of merchant fleets, of administrative patience, of national credit, of workers, far from the front, whose labor still reached the front, in usable form. One cigarette held none of this visibly, and yet it represented all of it. In ruined farmhouses, this lesson must have felt almost mystical. The German soldier had been told that America was artificial, rootless, and spiritually thin. Yet here was an artificial object arriving with relentless regularity from across an ocean. Here was rootlessness made powerful. Supply lines not tied to one valley, one city, one mythic homeland, but stretching through ports, depots, and truck routes across a continental economy and a maritime empire of shipping. Here was spiritual thinness translated into durable paper, sealed cartons, and repeat delivery. The propaganda had mistaken theatrical hardness for actual resilience. The Americans were not stronger because they despised comfort. They were stronger because they could mass-produce comfort without ceasing to mass-produce war. There is a profound ideological wound hidden in that realization. Totalitarian systems promise transcendence through sacrifice. They ask men to believe that the ability to endure less is proof of superiority. Democracies, when functioning well, promise something humbler and more dangerous to the totalitarian imagination. That ordinary life matters, that the common soldier's appetite matters, that small comforts deserve logistical protection, that the state serves the citizen even when the citizen wears a uniform. American wartime practice never perfectly fulfilled that promise, and often betrayed it in different ways. But compared with the world Germany had made by 1945, the contrast was brutal. One system consumed men faster than it could replenish the basics. The other could bury its dead and still ship tobacco. The cigarette, then, became a recurring witness. It glowed in trenches, in ambulance queues, in transport columns idling on wet roads, in villages just abandoned by one army and entered by another. It glowed between the fingers of men who would not live to see home and in the hands of civilians who traded it for supper. It glowed over maps, beside fuel drums, and in the corners of field kitchens. It glowed in the blacked-out pauses between artillery missions. It glowed on occupation streets where official money had died. A little white rod of paper and leaf should not have carried so much meaning. Yet war always compresses abstractions into objects. Freedom becomes a letter from home. Tyranny becomes an empty shelf. Industrial power becomes a truck convoy at midnight. And the American way of war, on certain winter evenings in Europe, became a cigarette exchanged in silence. For the Germans who noticed, this did not instantly produce admiration. More often, it produced bitterness, disbelief, and a kind of exhausted clarity. The enemy they had been taught to despise, as commercial and vulgar, had turned commerce into endurance. The society they had mocked as pleasure-loving had shown a frightening ability to supply pleasure and punishment simultaneously. Even at the level of vice, the United States could outlast them. This is what made the sight of American cigarettes being traded so psychologically corrosive. It suggested that the war was not simply being lost in headquarters, on maps, or in the sky. It was being lost in the invisible zones where economy becomes morale and morale becomes staying power. It was being lost in the distance between what a nation can make and what its soldiers can expect to receive. And once a soldier begins to understand that distance, ideology changes. He may still fight. He may still obey. He may still hate the enemy more fiercely than before. But something in the grand narrative starts to rot. The slogans about decadence no longer fit what his eyes report. The hierarchy of values rearranges itself. Romantic contempt for abundance becomes harder to maintain when abundance is rolling toward you on 6,000 trucks. Mockery of American shallowness becomes harder when American shallowness has enough depth to sustain a transatlantic war and flood a continent with goods down to the smallest comfort. The moment of transformation is quiet. No speech announces it. It happens in the mind, like a match being struck. One sees the ember. One understands. There is tragedy in how late many men learned this. By the time the lesson was unmistakable, cities were already cinders, railways broken, and entire generations irretrievable. The Reich's promises had narrow plenty attached to American uniforms and supply systems. The cigarette economy of post-war Germany was not merely a tale of black markets and profiteering. It was the afterimage of military logistics. It was what remained when a defeated society recognized, however grudgingly, that the goods of the victors held steadier worth than the symbols of the collapsed state. In that sense, the white cigarette, glowing in a ruined village in January 1945, already contained the occupation years inside it. So, the final meaning of that winter moment is larger than tobacco and larger than Germany. It tells us something uncomfortable and enduring about freedom, abundance, and ideology. Freedom is not sustained by rhetoric alone. It must be packed, counted, loaded, driven, distributed, and trusted. It must survive weather, distance, sabotage, fatigue, and human error. It must be ordinary enough to reach millions and desirable enough that people choose it when official structures fail. The United States did not defeat Nazi Germany because it had better cigarettes. It defeated Nazi Germany in part because it built a world in which even cigarettes became evidence of a deeper capacity, the ability of a vast, quarrelsome, commercial democracy to organize abundance on a scale the dictatorship could neither comprehend nor match. And so the ember remains. In imagination, it still burns at the edge of that January road, a tiny orange pulse against the cold masonry of Europe. Around it lie the broken certainties of a regime that worshipped hardness and delivered ruin. Within it glows another truth, less theatrical and more durable, that a free society, for all its noise and vulgarity and contradiction, can wield abundance as a form of power more persuasive than doctrine. The cigarette passes from hand to hand. Its smoke rises and vanishes. Yet what it revealed did not vanish. It revealed that the strength of America in the second from glory to delay, from destiny to mere postponement. Yet the cigarette remained stubbornly eloquent. It was easy to sneer at American advertising, American branding, American mass taste. It was harder to sneer at the practical consequences when those traits were welded to industrial output and military transport. The same civilization that made commercial abundance vulgar to aristocratic sensibilities had also made it transferable, repeatable, and battlefield relevant. One did not have to admire that civilization to see its force. One only had to watch what happened when its products reached starving ground. And perhaps this is why the image has endured. Not because cigarettes are noble, they are not. Not because war turns them into virtue, it does not. But because they were so ordinary. History often hides in the ordinary. A tank is expected to symbolize national power. A bomber obviously does. A cigarette should not. Yet in the rubble of Europe it did, precisely because it was unnecessary and still available. Shells must be supplied, or the army dies. Food must be supplied, or the army withers. But cigarettes? If those were arriving too, then the river behind the front was broad indeed. The German soldier who saw American cigarettes being traded did not just see tobacco. He saw surplus crossing into everyday life under combat conditions. He saw the enemy's abundance escaping its own intended channels and becoming social fact. By the end, that fact would outlive the war. In occupied Germany, when paper promises failed, cigarettes retained value because people believed in them. That belief had not emerged from nowhere. It had been prepared by months and years of visible. World war was not only that it could destroy, it was that it could supply, replenish, comfort, improvise, and continue. It could put fire in a rifle barrel and still leave enough for a match. And in the darkest winter of the war, some German soldiers saw that thin white cylinder being traded in the ruins and understood, too late, that the real arsenal of democracy was not only made of steel. Sometimes it was made of paper, leaf, habit, and trust. Sometimes the fate of an ideology could be read in the small red eye of a cigarette, refusing to go out.